There is a moment, and perhaps you have already lived it, when you stand in the middle of your own life and feel, with absolute certainty, that something is deeply wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, not the kind of wrong that announces itself with sirens and flames, but a quiet, persistent wrongness, like a stone in your shoe that you have learned to walk with, like a window left slightly open in winter, letting in just enough cold to make the room uncomfortable, but never enough to make you stop and close it. You keep moving, you keep smiling, you keep performing the rituals of a productive, functional, socially acceptable human being. And yet beneath all of it, there is this nagging, relentless whisper that says, "This is not the life you were meant to live. This is not the version of yourself you were meant to become." The ancient Stoics understood this whisper. They gave it a name. They called it the distance between who you are and who you could be, and they dedicated their entire philosophy to closing that gap. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the known world, sat alone in his tent at night and wrote in his private journal words never meant to be read by another soul about the daily struggle to become better, to remove the unnecessary, to strip away everything that cluttered the path toward virtue and wisdom. Epictetus, born a slave, who had nothing, not his freedom, not his body's safety, not even the guarantee of tomorrow, somehow arrived at a peace so profound that centuries later, his words still reach across time and touch something raw and true inside us. Seneca, a man of enormous wealth and political power, who understood that the greatest poverty a human being can experience is not the absence of money, but the absence of clarity about what truly matters. These men, separated by wealth, status, and circumstance, arrived at the same fundamental truth. The good life is not built by adding more. It is built by removing what does not belong. And that is what we are going to explore today, deeply, honestly, without the comfortable lies we usually tell ourselves. 15 things, 15 categories of weight that most people carry their entire lives without ever questioning whether they have to. 15 areas where the Stoic tradition, combined with the hard-won wisdom of human experience, points clearly toward a single, quiet, powerful act of liberation. Not a dramatic transformation, not a weekend retreat, not a social media announcement, a quiet removal, done in the privacy of your own commitment, done without fanfare, done because you finally decided that the weight is no longer worth carrying. Stay with me. Every minute of what follows is going to be worth your time. Welcome to Stoic Wisdom, the channel where we take the most profound philosophical traditions in human history and translate them into something you can actually use. Not as decoration, not as intellectual entertainment, but as a living framework for navigating the real complexity of being alive in this world, right now, today. If this is your first time here, we are genuinely glad you found us. The fact that you clicked on this video tells us something important about you, that somewhere inside, you are searching for more than distraction. You are searching for substance, for tools that work, for a way of thinking that holds up under pressure. And if you have been with us for a while, welcome back. You already know what this community is about. You already know that the conversations we have here are different, deeper, more honest, more willing to go to the places that most content refuses to go. Before we begin, we want to ask something of you, and we want to be direct about why we are asking. If this video reaches you, changes something in the way you see your life, gives you even one insight that you carry with you into tomorrow, please take a moment to like this video. That single action tells the algorithm that this kind of content deserves to be seen by more people. It is the most effortless thing you can do to support what we are building here, and its impact is genuinely significant. Leave a comment below. Tell us which of these 15 things resonates most deeply with you. Tell us what you are working on removing from your life. Tell us where you are in the journey. This channel is not a broadcast, it is a conversation, and your voice matters in it. We read your comments. We are shaped by them. Your honesty makes this community what it is. Share this video with someone who needs it. You already know who that person is. The friend who is exhausted, the family member who is stuck, the colleague who is going through something they have not found the words for yet. Sometimes the most profound act of care is simply pointing someone toward the right words at the right time. Subscribe to Stoic Wisdom and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new video. We work hard on every piece of content we release, and we want it to find you. And if you feel moved to support this channel in a deeper way, please consider sending a super thanks. Every contribution goes directly into making this channel better. Better research, better production, more time devoted to creating content that actually serves you. We are grateful for every single one. Now, let us begin. Part 1. The Philosophy of Removal. Before we walk through the 15 things, we need to establish something foundational. Because without this foundation, the list becomes just another self-help checklist. With it, it becomes something genuinely transformative. The Stoics did not talk about removal as a self-improvement strategy. They talked about it as a philosophical necessity. They believed, and the argument holds up remarkably well under scrutiny, that the natural state of the human soul is one of clarity, reason, and equanimity, not happiness in the shallow sense. Not the absence of difficulty, but a kind of deep-rooted stability that could not be shaken by external events because it was not built on external events. They called this eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but more accurately rendered as flourishing, the fullest expression of what a human being can be. And they argued that the reason most people never reach it is not because they lack the capacity. Every human being has the capacity. It is because most people spend their entire lives accumulating things, habits, relationships, beliefs, emotional patterns, social obligations, without ever asking the most important question: does this serve my flourishing, or does it obstruct it? That question, simple, direct, ruthless in its implications, is the lens through which every one of the 15 things we are about to discuss must be viewed. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." Simple words, but embedded in them is an entire philosophy of discernment, an entire practice of asking, again and again, whether what you are about to do, say, think, or pursue is aligned with your highest self, or whether it is pulling you away from it. Epictetus framed it differently. He talked constantly about what is up to us and what is not up to us, and he was not gentle about the implications. Most of what people worry about, most of what people chase, most of what people cling to not up to us. The only thing genuinely within our control is our own judgment, our own will, our own response to reality. Everything else is borrowed. Everything else can be taken. Everything else, if you are honest, was never really yours to begin with. Seneca, perhaps the most practical of the three great Stoics, put it most plainly: "It is not that I am brave enough to face great evils. It is that I have learned to recognize how few of the things I feared were truly worth fearing, and how much of my suffering was self-inflicted through my own choices about what to hold on to." Self-inflicted. That word sits uncomfortably, does it not? Because it implies agency, and agency implies responsibility. And responsibility, real responsibility, not the performative kind we display for others, but the kind we exercise in private, is both the most difficult and the most liberating thing a human being can embrace. The Stoics were not asking you to become a monk. They were not asking you to abandon pleasure, or success, or human connection. They were asking you to look honestly at what you are carrying and ask whether it is serving you, and then to have the quiet, undramatic courage to put down the things that are not. That is what this video is. A guided walk through the most common weights, an honest conversation about what they cost you, and a clear, grounded articulation of what becomes possible when you set them down. Let us begin with the first. Thing 1. the need for constant approval. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not show up in blood tests or sleep studies. It does not present as a symptom that a doctor can identify or a medication can touch. It is the exhaustion of people who have spent years, sometimes decades, building their lives around the opinions of others, not around their own values, not around their own sense of what is right or meaningful or true, around the shifting, inconsistent, often contradictory judgments of the people around them. You have felt it, the way you edit yourself before you speak, calculating how the words will land, the way you choose your clothes, your social media posts, your career decisions, your hobbies, your opinions, with one eye always on the audience. The way you feel a quiet but real anxiety when someone seems disappointed in you, or critical of you, or simply indifferent to you. The way that anxiety can ruin an afternoon, or a week, or quietly color an entire decade of your life. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that every person who struggles with this needs to read slowly, more than once. I have often wondered how it is that every man loves himself more than all the rest of men, but yet sets less value on his own opinion of himself than on the opinion of others. Read that again. You love yourself more than anyone else. That is the raw, biological fact of human self-preservation, and yet you consistently value what others think of you more than what you think of yourself. You outsource the most important judgment in your life, the judgment of your own worth, to people who are, quite literally, not qualified to make it. People who do not know your history, people who do not understand your internal struggle. People who are, themselves, often so consumed by their own need for approval that they barely have bandwidth to form genuine assessments of anyone else. This is not cruelty, this is observation. And the observation is important because it exposes something crucial. The approval you are seeking from others is largely a projection. You are not really seeking their approval. You are seeking the approval of an idealized version of yourself that you have never allowed yourself to fully become, because you have been too busy performing for an audience that was never really watching as carefully as you thought. Epictetus was, on this subject, almost brutal in his directness. He said, and I am paraphrasing from memory of his teachings, "If you wish to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid with regard to external things. Do not wish to be thought to know anything. And if some think you to be a person of importance, distrust yourself. Do not wish to be thought to know anything. Be content to be thought foolish." These are not comfortable instructions. They are not the kind of thing you put on a motivational poster, but they point towards something genuinely liberating, the freedom that comes from releasing the performance. Because here is what happens when you stop performing for approval. First, there is a period of discomfort. You feel exposed, vulnerable, uncertain. The scaffolding you built your identity on suddenly feels less stable. This is normal. This is, in fact, the feeling of growth. But then something else happens. You start to discover what you actually think, what you actually want, what you actually believe, when you are not filtering it through the imagined reactions of an audience. And you discover, often with something approaching shock, that this version of you, the unperformed, unedited, approval-independent version, is considerably more interesting, more capable, and more at peace than the performed version ever was. The Stoics called this living according to nature, meaning living in alignment with your rational nature, your capacity for reason and judgment, rather than in response to the irrational, fluctuating opinions of the social environment around you. How do you begin to remove this need? Not by announcing that you no longer care what people think. That announcement is itself a performance for approval. You remove it quietly. You begin by noticing, in real time, when a decision is being made primarily to manage someone else's perception of you. You pause. You ask, what would I do here if no one was watching? And then, and this is the hard part, you do that. Not always, not perfectly, not overnight, but you begin, and you notice, over time, that the world does not end when you stop performing for it. that the people who mattered do not actually require your performance, that the people who only valued the performance were never really seeing you anyway. The need for constant approval is a cage built from other people's opinions, and only you hold the key. Thing 2, relationships that consistently diminish you. This is the one that takes the longest to address, because here, unlike with abstract habits or patterns of thought, we are talking about human beings. Real people, with real histories with you, real emotional complexity, real claims on your loyalty and your heart. And the Stoics, for all their discipline and clarity in other areas, did not pretend this was simple. They did not advocate for a cold, transactional approach to human connection. Quite the opposite. The Stoic tradition places extraordinary value on genuine friendship, what they called true friendship, as distinct from friendships of utility or pleasure. Marcus Aurelius wrote with profound gratitude about the people in his life who taught him, challenged him, and loved him honestly. Seneca devoted entire letters to the nature of real friendship and what it means to be a genuine friend. But the Stoics were also clear rigorously, uncomfortably clear, that not every relationship deserves to be maintained simply because it exists. Not every bond deserves to be honored simply because it is old. And the criterion for evaluation is neither cruelty nor indifference, but clarity. Does this relationship make it easier or harder for you to become the person you are trying to be? Think about the relationships in your life, not the abstract category of relationships, but the specific, named, real ones. Think about the people you spend the most time with, the people whose voices live in your head, the people whose opinions shape your decisions even when they are not in the room. Now ask, honestly, after time with this person, do you typically feel more energized or more depleted? Do you feel more clear about who you are and what you value, or do you feel confused, diminished, or vaguely ashamed? Does this person bring out your intelligence, your warmth, your best instincts, or do they consistently call forward your anxiety, your smallness, your worst patterns? Some of you are thinking of a specific person right now, and you have been thinking of them for a long time. And you have been telling yourself, for a long time, the various reasons why you cannot, should not, would not remove them from your life. Because removing someone from your life feels like an act of violence, even when maintaining them there is one. Epictetus taught that we must distinguish between things that are up to us and things that are not up to us. Another person's character, their choices, their patterns, their willingness to change, not up to us. But our choice of who we spend our limited time and energy with, that is absolutely, entirely, non-negotiably up to us. There are several categories of relationship that the Stoic tradition and basic wisdom suggest we examine most carefully. The first is the chronically critical relationship. This is the person who, regardless of your growth, your efforts, or your accomplishments, consistently finds the flaw, the gap, the area of inadequacy, and perhaps they frame it as just being honest or trying to help you improve. But there is a profound difference between the honest feedback of someone who genuinely wants you to flourish and the reflexive criticism of someone who, for reasons of their own psychology, needs to see you as smaller than you are. One builds you, the other corrodes. The second is the consistently draining relationship, the person whose interactions primarily consist of crisis, complaint, and emotional demand, with little reciprocity, little curiosity about your inner life, and little capacity to offer genuine support when you need it. These relationships are characterized by an imbalance so deep and so persistent that over time they train you to suppress your own needs in order to manage theirs. The third is the relationship that keeps you trapped in an old version of yourself, the friend who still refers to you by the nickname you had at 19, the family member who insists, against all evidence, on seeing you through the lens of who you were at your lowest point. These relationships are not necessarily malicious. They often come from love, but they can be genuinely inhibiting to growth. When the people around you cannot see who you are becoming, it becomes harder to become it. Seneca wrote, Associate with people who are likely to improve you. This sounds simple. It is, in practice, one of the most courageous things a person can do, because improving associations often means releasing comfortable ones. It means choosing growth over familiarity. It means accepting a period of loneliness as the price of eventually finding deeper, more honest, more nourishing connection. This is not about writing people off. This is not about issuing declarations or burning bridges. The Stoics were not melodramatic. This is about quietly, without announcement, without resentment, without the drama of a great confrontation, shifting where you invest your most precious resources, your time, your attention, your emotional energy. You do not have to hate someone to decide that you will spend less time with them. You do not have to condemn a relationship to acknowledge that it is not serving your flourishing. You can hold someone with warmth and humanity while also, honestly, acknowledging that your relationship with them requires you to be less than you are. That honest acknowledgement, quiet, private, without performance, is the beginning of the removal. Thing 3, the habit of complaining. Marcus Aurelius, who by any objective measure had more to complain about than most of us will ever experience, he governed an empire perpetually at war, suffered profound personal losses, dealt with betrayal at the highest levels of power, and battled what historians believe was a serious chronic illness, almost never complained. And when he wrote about the temptation to complain in the private pages of his meditations, he was characteristically direct about why he resisted it. Not because complaints are impolite, not because they are a sign of weakness, but because they are philosophically incoherent, because they represent a fundamental confusion about what reality owes you and what you owe yourself. To complain in the deep, habitual sense we are talking about is to make 3 implicit claims simultaneously. The first claim is that this situation is wrong. The second is that you are powerless to change it. The third is that expressing your dissatisfaction about it serves some useful purpose. And the Stoics examined all 3 claims and found them, in most circumstances, to be either false or misleading. Is the situation wrong? Perhaps. But many of the things we complain most about are not wrong in any cosmic sense. They are simply inconvenient, uncomfortable, or different from what we preferred. The traffic is heavy, the weather is uncooperative, a colleague is difficult, a plan did not unfold as expected. These are not injustices. They are the ordinary texture of a life lived in contact with reality. Calling them wrong does not make them wrong. It merely adds a layer of resentment to an already uncomfortable situation. Are you powerless to change it? Sometimes, genuinely, yes. And this is precisely where the Stoic distinction between what is and is not up to us becomes most useful. If something is genuinely beyond your control, then complaint is not only useless, it is actively harmful. It focuses your attention and energy on the very thing you cannot change, keeping you trapped in a cycle of frustration that serves no one. If something is within your power to change, however, then complaint is an avoidance of action. It is what you do instead of doing the thing. And this is where the habit becomes most costly, because habitual complaining can train us to misidentify our own agency. We start to experience ourselves as more powerless than we actually are, because we have spent so long rehearsing the narrative of our powerlessness. Does expressing the complaint serve some useful purpose? This is the most nuanced question, because the answer is sometimes yes. Naming a genuine problem, communicating clearly about what is not working, advocating for change, these are not complaints. These are productive expressions of dissatisfaction directed toward a constructive end. The distinction is in the intention. Does the expression move you toward a solution, or does it merely reinforce the grievance? Epictetus, who had every right to complain, who had been enslaved, who had been physically abused, who lived in material poverty, wrote about the complaint habit with a kind of amused contempt. He observed that most people who complain do not actually want solutions. They want agreement. They want their experience of being wronged to be validated and amplified by those around them. And he pointed out that this desire for communal reinforcement of grievance is one of the most effective mechanisms for keeping a person permanently stuck. Here is what happens when you remove the complaint habit from your life. Not by suppressing your legitimate grievances, not by pretending that difficult things are fine, but by genuinely committing to a practice of not vocalizing dissatisfaction unless you are doing so in service of a constructive end. You start to notice how much of your mental space was occupied by rehearsed complaints, the running internal monologue of everything that is wrong, everything that is unfair, everything that is not as it should be. And as you stop giving that monologue an audience, it begins to quiet. And in the quiet, you discover something remarkable. The energy that was going into the complaint was actually available the whole time. It was just misdirected. The Stoics called this energy pneuma the vital force of rational engagement with reality. When it is deployed in complaint, it is wasted. When it is redirected toward purposeful action, the results are, over time, genuinely extraordinary. Remove the complaint, not the awareness of what is difficult, not the honest communication of what matters to you, but the reflexive, habitual, unproductive narration of everything that has failed to meet your preferences. Replace it not with toxic positivity, but with the quiet, steady question. Given where I am, what is the wisest thing I can do right now? Thing 4. The belief that you are your past. Of all the weights people carry, this one may be the heaviest and the cruelest, because it is built not from other people's judgments, not from external circumstances, but from your own memory, from the stories you tell yourself about who you have been and what that means about who you can become. You made mistakes. Of course you did. You said things you wish you could take back. You made choices that caused harm to others and to yourself. You failed at things that mattered. You were not, at various points in your life, the person you wish you had been. You were afraid when you wanted to be brave. You were small when you wanted to be generous. You chose comfort when you knew, in the part of yourself that always knows, that you should have chosen growth. And you remember, because the human memory, for reasons that are deeply complex and probably evolutionary, tends to weight negative experiences more heavily than positive ones. You may have 100 moments of kindness and wisdom in your past, but it is the handful of failures, the specific instances of falling short of your own standards, that show up at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and the defenses are down. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Confine yourself to the present." Not as an instruction to ignore the lessons of the past, the Stoics were deeply committed to learning from experience, but as a reminder that the present moment is the only place where anything can actually happen. The past is fixed, immutable. It cannot be changed by your guilt or your regret or your years of rehearsing it. But the present is alive with possibility. And every moment you spend imprisoned in the past is a moment stolen from the present. Epictetus taught something even sharper. He pointed out that the relationship you have with your past is not a relationship with an objective reality. It is a relationship with your interpretation of that reality, with the story you have chosen to tell about it. And the story, unlike the events themselves, is something you have genuine power over. This is not to say that the past did not happen. It did. And the consequences of past actions are real and must be dealt with honestly. But the story, the meaning, the judgment you render about who you are based on who you have been, that is a construction. And like all constructions, it can be examined, questioned, and if it is not serving your flourishing, revised. There is a concept in Stoic philosophy called prohieresis, the faculty of choice, the capacity for reasoned judgment. The Stoics believed that this faculty was the most essentially human thing about us. And they believed, crucially, that it operates in the present. It is not bound by the past. Every single moment, regardless of what came before, contains within it the genuine possibility of choosing differently. This is not a comfortable thought, because it eliminates the excuse. If you truly have the capacity in this moment to choose the person you want to be, then the past is not your prison. It is only your excuse. And the Stoics were not gentle about the distinction between the two. What does it look like to remove the belief that you are your past? It begins with a form of accounting, not the punitive, self-flagellating accounting that most people engage in, where they rehearse their failures in excruciating detail and conclude that the failures define them, but a genuine, honest, Stoic accounting. What happened? What was within my control? What was not? What did I learn? What would I do differently? And then, crucially, what does that learning ask of me now, in the present? That last question is the pivot, because it turns the gaze from backward to forward. It transforms the past from a weight into a resource. The Stoics were deeply interested in the past as a teacher in the experiences of history, of great men and women who had faced difficulty and responded with wisdom or with folly, as a guide for present action. But the teacher is only useful if you are a student, not a prisoner. You are not the worst thing you have ever done. You are not the most shameful moment you have ever lived. You are not permanently defined by the times you fell short. You are, right now, in this moment, the person who has the capacity to choose, and that capacity is not diminished by your past. In some ways, in the ways that honest experience, honestly faced, always refines the capacity for wisdom, it is strengthened by it. Release the story that your past is your permanent address. It was a place you visited. You do not have to live there. Thing 5. Excessive consumption of outrage and negativity. We live, at this particular moment in history, inside one of the most sophisticated systems for the generation and delivery of outrage ever constructed. The algorithms that govern what you see, what you hear, what fills the first moments of your morning and the last moments of your evening, they are not neutral. They are optimized with extraordinary technical precision to capture and hold your attention. And the single most reliable mechanism for capturing human attention, it turns out, is outrage, anger, fear, moral indignation, the satisfying, addictive sense of being one of the people who sees clearly, who knows what is really happening, who understands the depths of the danger while the unenlightened masses stumble around in comfortable ignorance. This is not an accident, it is a design. And the Stoics, who obviously could not have anticipated the specific form this would take, nonetheless understood the underlying mechanics with remarkable precision. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about what we might call the pollution of the mind, the way that certain inputs, when consumed repeatedly, begin to shape thought patterns in ways that are not chosen but are, rather, imposed. He was deeply concerned with what he called the ruling faculty, the hegemonikon, the center of reasoned judgment that is the most essential part of a human being. And he was acutely aware of how easily this faculty could be corrupted by careless attention. What you feed your mind shapes your experience of reality. This is not mysticism, it is neuroscience, as well as ancient philosophy. If you spend 4 hours a day consuming content that presents the world as a dangerous, corrupt, irredeemably unjust place full of enemies who wish you harm, your brain will begin to experience the world that way. Not because the world necessarily is that way, but because the filtering system through which you interpret experience has been conditioned to see through that particular lens. Epictetus spoke about the importance of guarding what he called the door of the soul, the threshold through which impressions enter and shape the rational faculty. He taught that the first act of wisdom is not the grand philosophical gesture, but the quiet, daily discipline of choosing what you allow in. This is not about being uninformed. The Stoics valued knowledge, including knowledge of difficulty and injustice. Marcus Aurelius was not ignorant of the challenges facing his empire. He spent decades dealing with them directly. But there is a profound difference between being informed and being marinated in outrage. Between understanding the challenges of the world and spending your finite mental energy in a state of chronic, performative, largely unproductive fury about things you cannot directly change, the outrage cycle is particularly insidious because it feels like engagement, it feels like caring, it feels like being awake and aware while others sleep. But most of the time, it is a sophisticated form of passivity, the consumption of emotional intensity as a substitute for genuine action. You are not changing anything. You are not helping anyone. You are processing an endless stream of carefully curated content designed to make you feel that the act of feeling outraged is itself a form of participation in the world. It is not, and the Stoics would be unimpressed. What would they recommend instead? Not ignorance, not comfortable avoidance, but intentionality, deliberate, disciplined curation of what you allow to occupy your most precious resource, your attention. Which sources of information genuinely serve your understanding and your capacity for constructive action? Which ones merely generate emotional agitation without corresponding practical value? And are you consuming what you consume because it serves you, or because the mechanics of the platform have made it nearly effortless to remain in a state of continuous reactive stimulation? Remove, or drastically reduce, the consumption of content whose primary function is to generate outrage. Not all of it, some outrage is appropriate and necessary, a signal from the moral intelligence that something genuinely wrong is happening. But the reflexive, habitual, algorithmically delivered outrage that fills so many lives that serves no one, least of all you. In the space that opens up, you might discover something remarkable. The world, when experienced without the outrage filter, is considerably more nuanced, more interesting, and more full of genuine opportunity for meaningful contribution than the algorithm ever wanted you to believe. Thing 6. The fear of failure. Seneca, in one of his letters to Lucilius, makes an observation that should be carved somewhere visible in every school, every office, every place where human beings go to attempt difficult things. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. The fear of failure is not primarily a response to actual failure. It is a response to imagined failure, to the detailed, vivid, emotionally compelling story your mind constructs about what failure would mean, about how it would feel, about what people would think, about who it would prove you to be. And the story is almost always worse than the reality. This is not optimism. It is an observation that has been made independently by philosophers, psychologists, and ordinary people who have lived through enough failures to develop perspective on them. Failure, when it actually arrives, is typically more manageable and more instructive than its imagined version, and the anticipatory suffering, the months or years of constricted living, of withheld attempts, of potential left unrealized in service of avoiding the risk of failure that is almost always worse than the failure itself would have been. Marcus Aurelius wrote about what he called the art of living with an interesting emphasis. He did not frame it as the art of succeeding. He was explicit that a life of genuine philosophical depth involves regular encounters with difficulty, with failure, with outcomes that diverge from what was desired. What determines the quality of that life is not the absence of such encounters, but the quality of response to them. He returned repeatedly to the image of fire and iron, the way that intense heat, which seems purely destructive, is actually the process by which formless material becomes something useful. The blacksmith does not apologize for the fire. The philosopher does not apologize for difficulty. Both understand that the resistance is not the enemy of what they are trying to make. It is an essential part of the making. Epictetus had an even more direct approach. He suggested that the way to eliminate the fear of failure is to practice what he called negative visualization, the deliberate contemplation of the worst case, not as a form of pessimism, but as a kind of inoculation. By fully imagining the worst possible outcome and working through it carefully, how would I actually respond? What would I actually do? Is this actually survivable? You strip the imagined catastrophe of its power over you. The answer, almost always, is yes. Yes, it is survivable. Yes, you would respond. Yes, you have more resources than the fear claims you do. And once you have genuinely reckoned with the worst case, the fear of it loosens its grip, not entirely, not overnight, but meaningfully, practically, in ways that allow you to begin. Because beginning is the only thing that matters. The failure or success of an attempt cannot be known in advance. What can be chosen right now is whether or not to attempt. And the Stoics were absolutely clear on this. The attempt, made with full engagement and honest effort, is always the right choice. The withholding of the attempt, in service of maintaining the comfortable illusion that the potential was there but simply never deployed, that is the real failure. The failure that never announces itself as a failure because it never even showed up to be evaluated. What have you not attempted because of the fear of failure? What potential has been sitting in you, waiting, while the fear convinces you that the timing is not right, that you are not ready, that the risk is too great? The Stoics would ask you to look at that unrealized potential and ask honestly, which is the greater loss? To try and fail and learn from it and try again with more wisdom, or to never try at all and carry the weight of the unlived attempt into every future day of your life? Remove the fear not by pretending it is not there, but by refusing to allow it to be the primary input in your decisions. Acknowledge it, examine it honestly, and then act anyway. Thing 7, the compulsion to control what cannot be controlled. Perhaps more than any other idea in Stoic philosophy, this one has the capacity to fundamentally transform the texture of daily life. Because the attempt to control what cannot be controlled, and more specifically, the anxiety and suffering that results from that attempt, is the source of an enormous proportion of human misery. Think about the last time you were genuinely distressed. Not physically hurt, not facing an actual emergency, but psychologically distressed, anxious, frustrated, afraid, angry. What was the distress about? Almost certainly, it was about something outside your control. The behavior of another person, an outcome that depended on factors beyond your reach, an uncertain future that refused to resolve itself on the timeline your nervous system preferred, a world that declined to cooperate with your vision of how things should be. Marcus Aurelius addressed this with characteristic directness. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. What sounds simple in translation carries, in its original context, the weight of a lifetime of practical philosophy. Marcus faced external events of extraordinary difficulty, military campaigns, political betrayal, the deaths of children, the persistent threat of his own assassination, and he returned again and again to this fundamental distinction, because it was not merely a nice idea, it was a survival strategy. Epictetus organized his entire philosophical framework around this distinction. The dichotomy of control, what the Stoics called ta f hemen, things up to us, and ta uk f hemen, things not up to us, is not a peripheral idea in Stoic philosophy. It is the central architecture. What is up to us? Our judgments, our desires, our aversions, our impulses, our responses to what happens. These are genuinely within our control, imperfectly, with effort and practice, but genuinely. What is not up to us? Everything else. Other people's opinions, choices, and actions. Our bodies and their health. Our reputation, our wealth, our circumstances, the weather, the political situation, the behavior of institutions, the outcomes of our efforts, which depend in part on factors we cannot fully see or manage. When we treat things in the second category as if they belong in the first, when we act as though sufficient worry, sufficient effort, sufficient will can bring them fully under our command, we create suffering. Not because the world is punishing us, but because we are expending genuine psychological energy in a fundamentally futile direction. Here is the thing about the control compulsion that makes it so persistent. It often works, partially, sometimes. You push hard enough, you worry thoroughly enough, you micromanage carefully enough, and occasionally the outcome you were trying to control does, in fact, approximate what you wanted. And this intermittent reinforcement trains the behavior. The compulsion grows. The anxiety spreads to new domains. And eventually, you find yourself in the exhausting situation of a person trying to control not just their immediate environment, but the thoughts and feelings of everyone around them, the trajectory of their relationships, the perception others have of them, the course of their career, the opinions of the culture at large. This is not strength. This is fear wearing the costume of diligence. The Stoic alternative is not passivity. It is not resignation. It is not the lazy comfort of whatever will be, will be. It is something much more demanding and much more honest. It is the practice of engaging fully, intelligently, with maximum effort, with everything that lies within your power, and simultaneously releasing, genuinely releasing, your grip on outcomes that were never yours to determine. This requires a kind of courage that is different from the courage of action. It is the courage of trust. Trust that you can respond to whatever happens. Trust that your capacity for genuine response is enough. Trust that the loss of control over outcomes does not mean the loss of everything that matters. Seneca, near the end of his life, with remarkable equanimity, wrote that he had learned to distinguish between the things he could genuinely influence and the things he merely wished he could. And he described the experience of releasing his grip on the latter as something close to relief. The profound physical relief of putting down a weight that was never meant to be carried. Where are you expending energy in the attempt to control what cannot be controlled? And what would become possible? What space would open up if you were to redirect that energy toward the one domain that is genuinely yours? Your own judgment, your own response, your own character. Thing 8. Comparison as a standard of worth. Here is a question that sounds simple but is actually quite unsettling. Whose life are you comparing yours to? Because the comparison instinct, the reflexive measurement of your own situation against someone else's, is one of the oldest and most reliable sources of unnecessary suffering in human experience. It predates social media by several thousand years. It was a problem the Stoics identified with precision and addressed with characteristic directness. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Do not indulge in dreams of what you do not have, but count the blessings actually present and think how much you would desire them if they were not already yours." The psychology here is precise. What you have habituated to. It no longer generates the same sense of gratitude and abundance that it would if you suddenly did not have it. But when you see what someone else has, the life, the body, the relationship, the career, the success, you experience it as it would feel to suddenly have it, not as it feels to have had it for years. And so, the comparison is fundamentally unfair. You are measuring your habituated reality against someone else's imagined newness. Epictetus addressed this from another angle. He pointed out that you are always comparing your internal experience with all its texture, its doubt, its complexity to someone else's external presentation. You know everything about your own struggle, your own fear, your own uncertainty. You know almost nothing about theirs. And so the comparison is not only unfair, it is conducted on the basis of systematically incomplete information. The person whose career you are comparing yours to unfavorably, you do not know the compromises they made to get there, the sacrifices, the relationships they neglected, the version of themselves they had to diminish in order to fit into the shape that the success required. The person whose relationship looks from the outside like what you want yours to be, you do not know what happens behind closed doors. You do not know the conversations they do not have, the loneliness they manage, the distance that has grown in places where intimacy used to live. The person whose body, whose wealth, whose freedom appears to put yours in an unflattering light, you do not know their history, their pain, the price they paid in currencies you cannot see. And even if you did know all of this, even if the comparison were perfectly informed and revealed genuine differences in circumstance or accomplishment, the Stoic question remains: what does this comparison serve? How does the measurement of your worth against another person's situation contribute to your flourishing? What constructive action does it make possible? Usually, none. The comparison, at best, temporarily motivates some action. More often, it simply generates the particular form of suffering the ancient Greeks called envy, the corrosive sense that what is good in another person's life is somehow bad for yours, that their flourishing diminishes yours. The Stoics regarded this as one of the most irrational of all human dispositions, because it is based on the false premise that life is a zero-sum game, that there is a fixed quantity of good, of success, of love, of meaning, of joy, and that someone else having more of it necessarily means you have less. This is not how reality works. But it is, unfortunately, how envy feels. The alternative the Stoics proposed is not the comfortable fiction that comparison is wrong, and we should all feel equally wonderful about ourselves regardless of effort or outcome. That is not honest, and the Stoics were deeply committed to honesty. The alternative is to change the referent of comparison. Instead of measuring your life against other people's lives, which can never yield accurate information and can never serve genuine growth, measure your current self against your past self. Ask not, how do I compare to them? But, how have I grown? What have I learned? Where am I more skillful, more wise, more aligned with my values than I was a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? This is a comparison that can actually serve you, because you have access to genuine information about both sides of it, because it locates the standard of evaluation where it belongs inside your own life, your own history, your own trajectory, and because it makes growth, rather than someone else's life, the measure of your worth. Thing 9. Busyness without purpose. There is a kind of busyness that looks, from the outside, like productivity, that fills the calendar and generates a continuous stream of action and output and social proof of engagement. That answers emails at midnight and attends every meeting and stays late and arrives early and never seems to stop. And it is, in many cases, a very sophisticated form of avoidance. Seneca, in one of the most powerful passages in all of classical literature, wrote this, and I want to give it the space it deserves. It is not that I have too little time, it is that I waste so much of it. He was writing to people who complained that life was too short, and his argument was that life is not too short, that for most people, life contains more than enough time to accomplish what genuinely matters. The problem is not the quantity of time. The problem is the quality of attention given to its use. He observed that people fill their days with activities that feel important without ever asking whether they are important, that they confuse the sensation of busyness, the constant motion, the packed schedule, the satisfying exhaustion of a full day with the substance of a meaningful life. And he was not gentle in pointing out that these are not the same thing, that you can be extremely busy and completely lost simultaneously. Marcus Aurelius echoed this in his Meditations. Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly, not as a morbid instruction but as a clarifying one, because the contemplation of death has a remarkable way of dissolving the false urgency of the non-essential. When you genuinely reckon with the fact that your time is finite, that the meetings and the emails and the social obligations and the performative busyness will not matter in 100 years, and perhaps not even next year, the question of what actually matters becomes much easier to answer. What is the purpose of what fills your days? Not what function does it serve in maintaining the machinery of your life, your income, your social relationships, your professional standing. These are not nothing. But beneath that, what is the meaning of it? What does it contribute to the life you are actually trying to build? What does it make possible that would not be possible without it? These are not questions that busyness encourages you to ask. Busyness, in fact, is partly valued precisely because it discourages such questions. When you are constantly in motion, there is no space for the uncomfortable inquiry into whether the motion is headed anywhere worth going. Epictetus taught that the examined life in the original Socratic sense, the life in which you regularly, honestly examine your choices, your priorities, your values, your direction, is not a luxury for philosophers with nothing else to do. It is a practical necessity for anyone who actually wants their life to be the kind of life they would choose. Remove the busyness that is not in service of anything you genuinely value. Not all busyness, some of what fills our days, is genuinely important and contributes to what matters. But the busyness that exists primarily to create the feeling of productivity, or to avoid the quiet in which real questions could be heard, or to maintain a social image of importance and engagement, that busyness is costing you something extraordinarily precious. It is costing you the time and attention that could be given to the things that actually matter to you, whatever those things are. The relationship you keep saying you will invest in when things slow down. The creative work you keep saying you will pursue when you finally have time. The inner life you keep saying you will attend to when you are less busy. The Stoics would tell you with characteristic directness, things will not slow down on their own. The busyness will not spontaneously organize itself into spaciousness. The calendar will not empty itself. The quiet will not arrive unbidden. You have to choose it, quietly, deliberately, in the face of everything that makes the choice uncomfortable. You have to decide, without fanfare, that a life with less busyness and more purpose is more worth living than a life with more busyness and less purpose, and then act accordingly. Thing 10. Attachment to how things should be. This one is subtle, because unlike the other weights we have discussed, it masquerades as high standards, as principle, as the reasonable expectation that life will conduct itself in accordance with basic logic and fairness, and sometimes it is. But more often, the attachment to how things should be is one of the most reliable mechanisms for disconnecting from how things actually are, and thereby losing the one thing that genuine engagement with reality requires: contact with truth. Marcus Aurelius wrote something worth sitting with. Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, and do so with all your heart. The key word is accept, not tolerate, not endure, not resign yourself to. Accept fully, with the understanding that what is, right now, is not a deviation from reality. It is reality, and reality is the only place where anything can actually be done. The attachment to should is everywhere. The meeting should have started on time. The project should have gone differently. My partner should have understood. The world should be fairer. The people in power should be wiser. I should be further along by now. Things should not be this way. And every one of these shoulds, every single one, represents a preference about how reality ought to be arranged that reality itself has declined to honor. And in the gap between the preference and the reality, suffering grows like mold in a damp corner. Epictetus, again with characteristic directness, pointed out that the should is always about what is not up to us. Because what is up to us, our own judgments, our own choices, those we can genuinely shape, we do not need to invoke should about our own will. We simply choose. The should appears precisely in the places where we are reaching beyond our actual power, where we are projecting our preferences onto a reality that has its own logic, its own laws, its own requirements. This does not mean that standards are wrong, that preferences do not exist, that you should not have a vision of what you are working toward. All of that is fine and good. The Stoics had extremely high standards for themselves, for human conduct, for the kind of person and society they were trying to build. But there is a crucial difference between having standards and demanding that reality conform to them as a precondition for your peace. The attachment to should makes peace conditional. It says, I will be okay when things are the way they should be. And since things are almost never exactly the way they should be, since life has a persistent and total indifference to our preferences about its arrangement, this amounts to an indefinite suspension of okayness, a permanent state of low-grade suffering, waiting for a condition that will never quite arrive. The Stoic alternative is what the philosopher Pierre Hadot called amor fati, the love of fate, not in the sense of naive acceptance of anything, not in the sense of abandoning effort or standard or will, but in the sense of a genuine philosophical embrace of what is, including its imperfection, its uncertainty, its refusal to be what you wanted as the actual material of your life, as the real thing you have to work with, as, in some deep sense, what you would choose if you were truly wise. Remove the attachment to should, not the vision, not the values, not the standard, but the attachment, the grasping, the insistence that reality be otherwise than it is before you will engage with it fully. What remains, when you genuinely practice this, is a kind of clarity that is very difficult to describe, an ability to see what is actually there, rather than what you wish were there. And from that seeing clear, unclouded by the filter of disappointed expectation, a much more accurate assessment of what can actually be done, and therefore, a much more effective response. Thing 11. The voice of relentless self-criticism. There is a voice in many people's heads that is doing something remarkable. It is doing the work of every external critic who has ever diminished them, every authority who has ever found them inadequate, every relationship in which they were made to feel small, doing all of that work from the inside, continuously, without being paid, without ever sleeping, without ever being asked whether the criticism is accurate, constructive, or serving any useful purpose whatsoever. This voice has a remarkable quality. It is almost always more harsh than any external critic would dare to be. It takes the material of your failures and your weaknesses, and your embarrassing moments, and your inadequacies, which every human being has in abundance, and it renders them not as ordinary facts of imperfect human experience, but as evidence for a verdict that was always going to come, that you are fundamentally, irreparably not enough. Marcus Aurelius was deeply interested in what he called the inner citadel, the fortress of the rational mind that cannot be breached by external forces. But he was equally attentive to the ways in which the inner citadel can be damaged not by external assault, but by the choices we make from within. The choice to entertain destructive thought patterns, the choice to rehearse, again and again, the evidence for our own inadequacy, the choice to be, toward ourselves, the kind of critic that we would never accept from anyone outside. The Stoics did not advocate for self-flattery. They were relentlessly honest about human imperfections, starting with their own. Marcus Aurelius's meditations are, in part, a catalog of the ways he fell short of his own standards and his efforts to do better. Epictetus spoke frankly about the work of philosophy as the work of recognizing and addressing one's own errors. Seneca wrote about his own foolishness and inconsistency with striking honesty. But honest self-examination and relentless self-criticism are not the same thing. Honest self-examination asks, what did I do? What was within my control? What can I learn? What will I do differently? It is forward-looking. It is purposeful. It closes in relatively quickly on actionable conclusions and then releases. Relentless self-criticism does not close. It does not conclude. It does not lead to action or learning or forward movement. It simply perpetuates. It finds the same evidence and renders the same verdict over and over with increasing certainty in an endless loop that serves no function except to confirm the original hypothesis that you are not enough, which it was never actually examining in the first place. It was always only confirming. Epictetus taught that the first requirement of genuine self-improvement is the honest acknowledgement that you have the capacity to improve. That is not nothing, it is actually a prerequisite that many people, drowning in self-criticism, cannot access. Because relentless self-criticism often comes coupled with a deep, hidden belief that improvement is not possible, that the critical verdict is not a diagnosis but a sentence. And if that is the belief, then no amount of effort will feel like enough, because the goal is not actually improvement. The goal, unconsciously, is confirmation of the sentence. Remove the relentless self-critical voice, not by replacing it with empty affirmation, not by pretending that you are without flaw or that your mistakes do not matter, but by applying to yourself the standard of honest, compassionate self-examination that you might apply to a close friend. If your closest friend came to you having made the same mistake you are currently punishing yourself for, would you condemn them in the terms your inner critic uses for you? Would you agree that this mistake defines their fundamental worth? Or would you acknowledge the error, discuss what could be done differently, and return your friend to the understanding that they are still, in the deepest sense, worthy of love, of effort, of another attempt? You are that friend, the Stoics would say. Apply the same standard. Thing 12. The postponement of living. Begin at once to live, wrote Seneca, and count each separate day as a separate life. 6 words that carry a lifetime of philosophical weight. Begin at once to live, not when the conditions are right, not when you have achieved the milestone that will finally make you feel ready, not when the uncertainty resolves, or the fear diminishes, or the circumstances align in the precise configuration you have decided is necessary. Now, today, in the actual, specific, imperfect, completely real life that is happening right now, whether or not it resembles the life you envisioned. The postponement habit is one of the most universal forms of self-abandonment in human experience. It takes many forms, and they are all, at their core, the same thing: the decision to withhold full engagement with the actual life in favor of waiting for the imagined life. I'll start when I'm less busy. I'll pursue that when I have more money. I'll invest in that relationship when things calm down. I'll take care of my health when the project is finished. I'll pursue meaning when I've secured stability. I'll live more fully when. When. It is one of the most dangerous words in the human vocabulary, because the when of the postponed life almost never arrives. Because the conditions that you are waiting for are always in the full light of honest examination, somewhat not yet right. Because the perfect moment has an uncanny tendency to remain just slightly in the future, always close enough to seem real, always just far enough away to justify another delay. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled an empire and had 1,000 legitimate reasons to say, "I'll attend to my philosophy when things are less demanding," chose instead to attend to it now, in the tent, between campaigns, in the stolen moments of a life packed with obligation and difficulty, because he understood with the clarity that real philosophical practice produces that there are no guaranteed tomorrows, that the future is not a reliable bank account into which you can make deposits of intention to be withdrawn as lived experience at a more convenient time. The Stoics practiced what is sometimes called memento mori, the remembrance of death, not as a morbid exercise but as a philosophical tool for clarifying what matters now. Not later, not eventually, now. Because the awareness of finitude has a remarkable way of burning through the comfortable illusion that there is endless time to begin. What are you postponing? And what are you telling yourself about why the postponement is reasonable? And the deeper question, the one the Stoics would actually want you to sit with, is the postponement protecting you from something? Because often what we are postponing is not just an action or a pursuit. It is a confrontation with ourselves, a reckoning with what we actually value, what we actually want, what we would actually do, if we stopped waiting for the conditions that make the doing feel safe. Begin at once to live, not dramatically, not with a grand gesture of transformation, but quietly, today, in the small choices that add up to a life. Give your full attention to the actual moment you are actually in. Treat this day, this ordinary, imperfect, possibly quite difficult day, as if it were the whole of your existence. Because in one very real sense, it is. The life is not somewhere ahead of you, waiting to be accessed when you are ready. The life is here. It is this. The only question is whether you are going to show up for it. Thing 13. The illusion that material things will complete you. Seneca was one of the wealthiest men in Rome. He owned multiple estates. He had more material comfort and security than almost anyone in the ancient world. And he wrote, with great clarity and zero nostalgia, about the absolute failure of that material wealth to provide what it promises. This is not the observation of someone who never had money. This is the observation of someone who had extraordinary amounts of it and found, in the having, that the promise was hollow, that the arrival at the material destination did not produce the peace, the fulfillment, the completion that the journey promised. The Stoics did not moralize about wealth. They did not teach that money is evil or that comfort is to be avoided or that poverty is spiritually superior. Marcus Aurelius used his position and his wealth to govern more effectively and to do more good. Seneca used his resources to live well and to write, which has benefited human beings for 2,000 years. Material security matters. Basic needs genuinely matter. The Stoics were not naive about this. What they were clear about is the distinction between what material things can genuinely provide and what they cannot. They can provide security. They can reduce unnecessary suffering. They can make certain kinds of meaningful activity possible. These are real goods. What they cannot provide is the thing most people are actually chasing when they pursue them: the feeling of being enough, the sense of completion, the interior peace that would make life feel genuinely worth living. Those things are not available in any store, at any price point, in any quantity. And the problem with not knowing this, the problem with maintaining the belief that the right amount of stuff, the right achievement, the right external marker of success will finally deliver the interior experience you are seeking, is that it creates an extraordinarily effective trap. Because material acquisition does, briefly, provide a version of the feeling you are looking for, the new purchase, in the first moments, genuinely feels like something. Novelty activates the reward system. There is real pleasure in the new, but habituation is relentless and fast. The new thing becomes the ordinary thing, becomes the old thing, and then the longing for the next thing, the thing that will finally do it, begins again. This cycle has no natural end. It is not a ladder with a top, it is a treadmill. Marcus Aurelius described this with characteristic directness. He pointed out that the people he observed who had the most wealth, the most status, the most power, were often the most restless, the most anxious, the most unable to sit with the actual texture of their lives without seeking the next distraction, while people with much less, who had made their peace with what they had, often exhibited a kind of interior richness that no amount of external acquisition could purchase. The Stoic concept of preferred indifference is useful here. This is the nuanced Stoic position on material things. They can be preferred rationally, appropriately, because they make life easier and make good actions more possible. But they must be held as indifferent in the deeper sense, meaning your fundamental peace, your sense of worth, your capacity for the good life must not depend on them, must not be contingent on having them. Because anything you genuinely need in order to be okay is something that can be taken from you and destroy your peace in the taking. Remove the belief that external completion is coming, not the goals, not the ambitions, not the intelligent pursuit of material security and success, but the belief that the arrival at those things will finally at last make you whole. That belief is one of the most effective mechanisms for deferring the interior work of actually becoming whole, which is available right now, regardless of what you have or do not have. Thing 14. Resentment and unprocessed anger. Seneca wrote something about anger that has stayed relevant across 2,000 years of human civilization. Anger is an acid that can do more harm to the vessel in which it is stored than to anything on which it is poured. Resentment, which is anger that has been stored rather than expressed or released, is perhaps the most corrosive of all the things we are discussing today. Because unlike some of the other weights, resentment has the particular quality of feeling righteous, of feeling justified, of feeling in some perverse way like a form of loyalty to yourself, evidence that you have not forgotten, that you are not going to simply let it go, that what was done to you mattered enough to be preserved in your anger. And perhaps what was done to you did genuinely matter. Perhaps the hurt was real, the injustice was genuine, the person was wrong. Acknowledging this is important, and the Stoics would acknowledge it. They were not advocates of pretending that harm was not harm, or that injustice was not injustice. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the nature of genuine wrongdoing and the appropriate response to it. But the appropriate response, in the Stoic framework, is not the indefinite storage of anger. Because here is the fundamental problem with resentment as a strategy. The person or situation you are resenting has, in most cases, moved on. They are not sitting with your anger. They are not experiencing its weight. You are. The resentment that began as a response to an external wrong has become a self-inflicted, ongoing wound. You are carrying, in the present, the injury of the past, and the carrying is doing more damage than the original wound. Epictetus was blunt about this. He who angers you, conquers you. This is not a comfortable thought for someone who has been genuinely wronged. It feels at first like it is adding insult to injury, like you are being asked not only to absorb the original harm, but to then release your anger about it as well, as if the anger were the problem rather than the person who caused it. But the philosophical point is not about assigning blame. It is about understanding where the power lies. When you are in a state of sustained resentment, your peace, your actual daily experience of being alive, is in the hands of the person or situation you are resenting. They have been given, by your sustained attention to them, an ongoing influence over your inner life. This is the conquest Epictetus is describing, not a moral victory for the person who wronged you, but a practical, real surrender of your most precious interior territory. The Stoic practice here is not forgiveness in the soft, religious sense, the idea that you must feel warmly toward the person who harmed you or pretend that the harm did not happen. It is something more practical and more honest than that. It is the decision to reclaim your own present moment, to stop feeding the resentment with your attention, to recognize that the anger has been paid forward long enough, that it has served whatever limited protective function it once served, and that continuing to carry it is now only serving the person who caused the original harm by continuing to give them residence in your mind, rent-free, long after the actual incident is over. Remove the resentment, not for their sake, not because they deserve your forgiveness, but because your peace, your actual daily lived experience of being alive, is more valuable than the symbolic statement of sustained anger. Because the interior space that opens up when resentment is finally released is one of the most profound experiences of freedom a human being can have. Thing 15, the unlived version of yourself. We come, at last, to the 15th and most important thing to quietly remove from your life. It is not a habit or a relationship or a belief pattern in the conventional sense. It is something more fundamental than any of those. It is the version of yourself that you have been living as, instead of the version of yourself you actually are. Every human being, somewhere in the territory of their interior life, knows the difference between the self they present to the world and the self they actually are, between the performed life and the real one. Between the choices made to manage other people's perceptions and the choices that would be made if no perception management were required, this gap between the performed self and the real self is the source of a very particular kind of suffering. Not the sharp suffering of a specific loss or failure, but the dull, persistent, sometimes barely conscious suffering of living at one remove from your own experience, of being in your life but not quite in it, of going through the motions of the life you were supposed to want without ever having genuinely asked whether it is the life you actually want. Marcus Aurelius, in the private pages of his journal, was working on this constantly. He was performing the role of emperor, a role he had not sought and did not particularly relish with everything he had. And simultaneously, he was working to align that performance with something genuine, to find, within the constraints of his actual life, the expression of his actual values, not the abstract philosophical values he wrote about, but the living, breathing, daily practice of them. He wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, not as an instruction to abandon ambition or direction, but as a reminder that the self you are becoming is being built in every present moment, by every present choice. The authentic self is not a destination you arrive at after the performance is over. It is what you choose right now, in this moment." Epictetus spoke about what he called your character, your fundamental moral and rational nature, as the one thing that is genuinely yours. Not your body, not your wealth, not your reputation, not your social role, your character. The person you are in the quiet, in the private, in the choices no one sees. And here is what the Stoic tradition says about that character. It is not fixed. It is not determined by your past choices or your current circumstances or the role the world has assigned to you. It is, in every moment, available to be expressed more fully, more honestly, more in alignment with your deepest values and your clearest reason. The unlived version of yourself is not a fantasy. It is not an impossibly perfect alternate reality. It is simply the version that makes choices more in alignment with your genuine values, that spends time in greater alignment with what actually matters to you, that speaks more honestly, engages more fully, lives with less performance and more presence. Removing the unlived version of yourself, putting it down, finally, once and for all, means accepting that the life you have is the only life you get, and that the question is not, what would I do if I were braver or freer or less encumbered, but what am I going to do now with what I actually have? This is the most difficult removal of all, because it requires the most honesty. It requires looking clearly at the gap between who you are and who you could be, not with the self-critical eye that renders that gap as evidence of your inadequacy, but with the clear, calm eye of the Stoic philosopher who sees the gap as simply the territory of the work ahead, and then beginning the work, quietly, without announcement, without the validation of anyone else's recognition, just you and the honest commitment to become, gradually, relentlessly, the version of yourself that your deepest wisdom has always known you could be. Conclusion: the philosophy of subtraction. We have walked through 15 territories today, 15 areas where the accumulated weight of habit, belief, relationship pattern, and emotional inheritance has been quietly obstructing the life you are capable of living. And I want to close with something that the Stoics understood with a clarity that is remarkable for its simplicity. The good life is not built by addition. It is not assembled from achievements and acquisitions and accumulations. It is revealed by subtraction, by the patient, honest, ongoing removal of everything that is not genuinely you until what remains is clear and true and finally, fully yours. This is not a one-time project. Marcus Aurelius did not write his meditations at the beginning of his journey and then consider the work complete. He wrote them across the arc of a life, returning again and again to the same fundamental questions, finding new depth in them with each return, applying them to new circumstances, refining his practice. The Stoic path is exactly that, a path, not a destination, not a transformation you achieve and then maintain without further effort, but a daily, moment-to-moment practice of choosing your response, choosing your attention, choosing, as consciously as possible, what you carry and what you set down. You do not have to do all 15 things at once. That is not how this works. Choose one, the one that resonated most deeply today, the one that you recognized most clearly in your own experience. And begin there. Begin quietly, without fanfare, without the social media announcement of a great transformation. Begin in the privacy of your own commitment, with the kind of gentle but absolute seriousness that the Stoics brought to everything they undertook. And as you begin, remember the words of Epictetus, who had every reason to believe that circumstances determined the quality of life, and chose instead to build a philosophy of unprecedented inner freedom on the simple, radical premise that they do not. Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. Make the best use of what is in your power. Everything we have discussed today falls into that category. Not easily, not without effort, not without the discomfort that always accompanies genuine growth, but genuinely, truly within your power. The rest take as it happens, with the equanimity of someone who has done the internal work, with the stability of someone who knows where their peace is actually located, with the quiet, unshakable dignity of someone who has decided, finally and completely, to live. And that is where we bring today's exploration to a close. If you have stayed with us this far, we want you to know that we see that. We know that choosing to spend time with philosophical content that asks you to look honestly at your own life rather than simply entertaining you, is a choice. And we do not take your choice lightly. We are genuinely grateful for it. Before you leave, we want to ask something of you that takes only a moment, but means a great deal to us. Please like this video right now. That single action, simple, immediate, effortless, tells the platform that this kind of content deserves to reach more people. Every like is a vote for depth over distraction, for substance over noise. We genuinely need it, and we genuinely appreciate it. Leave a comment below. Tell us which of the 15 things resonated most deeply with you. Tell us what you are working on removing from your life right now. Tell us about the Stoic principle that you find most challenging, or most useful, or most unexpected. We read every comment on this channel. Your words shape the conversations we have next. You are not talking into a void. You are talking to us and to each other. And this community grows richer with every voice that joins it. Share this video with someone who needs it today. You already know who that is. The person who is carrying something too heavy and does not yet have the language for it. The person who is living someone else's life and has not yet found the courage to reclaim their own. The person who is stuck in a pattern they can feel but cannot name. This video might be the thing that helps. Share it. Subscribe to Stoic Wisdom and turn on the notification bell. We release new videos regularly, and each one is built with the same care and depth that you experience today. We do not make content for the algorithm. We make it for you, and we want it to find you every time. And if this video moved something in you, if it changed something, clarified something, gave you something you will carry into tomorrow, please consider supporting this channel with a super thanks. It is a direct way to say that what we are building here matters to you, and every single contribution makes it possible for us to continue building it. We are grateful beyond what words can adequately express for every person who has supported us in this way. The Stoics taught that the unexamined life is not worth living, but they also taught, and this is the part we find most compelling, most genuinely useful, that the examined life is not merely worth living. It is, in the deepest and truest sense, the only kind of life that earns the name. Go examine yours, go live it, and we will see you in the next one. This has been Stoic Wisdom. We are glad you are here.